Starting us off this morning is Command Master Chief SEAL Peter Musselman, the Special Operations Command Europe Senior Enlisted Leader. Command Master Chief Musselman has a very diverse career, starting off as a Marine, doing a lateral transfer to the Navy, becoming a SEAL. His association with JSOU is at the Senior Non-Commissioned Officer Academy, and Command Master Chief Musselman, as a Master Chief and Command Master Chief, has had several command and operational assignments in his career. We are fortunate to have him talk this morning about the SOCUR perspective. So, Command Master Chief Musselman, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, General Howard, and to all the members of the SOF Nation and colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're at. I'm dialing in from Stuttgart, Germany. So my intent is to transmit here for maybe 10 or 15 minutes on the topic of resistance and resilience as we see it here at SOCUR. But I'd really be interested in opening up a dialogue and answering any questions anyone has, or if you have challenge our assumptions, the way we're looking at the problem set, please do. We're always looking to improve and make ourselves better. So when we talk about resilience and resistance, I think first and foremost, what we need to realize is every country is different. And while there's a history of resistance activities here in Europe, World War II obviously being a great example, the countries look at it differently. And while U.S. SOF, we move forces around and engage with almost every country in Europe. For the 30 that are in NATO, again, we engage with almost every one of those every year. But they all look at the concept of resistance differently. Some don't even want to bring up the term resistance, right? Because they look at that as, well, if I'm acknowledging that I need to prepare for resistance, then I'm acknowledging the fact that I have a concern that my country is going to be taken over. So again, I think you have to bear all that in mind, when you engage with nations, specifically when you talk about resistance. So to that point, we talk about resistance in the U.S. military and in U.S. SOF, whereas NATO SOF headquarters, they've taken the approach of comprehensive defense. That language seems to resonate and is more welcome in certain nations. So again, it all comes down to words, right? Words matter. So another thing to keep in mind when it comes to resistance is, depending on the country, the SOF elements within the nation, they may see the value of resistance and preparing for resistance in phase 0, where their general purpose force, maybe even their minister of defense and their government don't see the value in it. So while we're working with our SOF partners and trying to develop capabilities to be able to undertake resistance in the event that there was an incursion, a lot of times it's an uphill battle within that host nation trying to get the greater military and the government to see the value in resistance. So one other thing we have to keep in mind, right? America, we're very guilty of going into places and trying to make them do things or trying to make them see things the way we do. And right, that's not the case. Every country's different. So when it comes to resistance, we can't want it more than they do, right? They have to want to do it. They have to have the desire to put in the time, energy, manpower, and money. And that's not always the case. Some of the places we go with SOF in Europe, they're like, hey, I got it, understand you guys are interested in resistance, but we're not. And that's okay. That's okay, right? We're there to help them be what they want to be, and take their SOF where their SOF wants to go. So when we talk about resilience and resistance, um, we here at SOC, we think probably the greatest value that U.S. SOF brings is left of bang in that phase zero area, right? Where we can help the host nation, we can work with their SOF as well as their territorial defense or home guard type organizations to, talk through, hey, how would this work if there was an incursion in your country? How would we do this? How would U.S. SOF support? How would the host nation SOF work through those territorial defense or home guard organizations to affect a resistance? And a lot comes into that, right? Logistics in a contested environment, clearly a big challenge. Um, so again, as we look at resistance and we look at, how do we approach resistance? It's a country by country specific event. They're all different, and for some of them they're landlocked. So the only way to get in there is via ground or via air. Other nations you can come in via the water. So looking at how you establish resistance is going to be different again depending on the nation. So back to my point about the importance of phase zero and kind of how we view phase zero as where SOF has the best value proposition when it comes to resistance. One of the things we lean on heavily is information operations, and what I mean by that is messaging. It kind of, if you think of the adage of the if the porcupine's got enough quills on it, the bear's not going to take a bite out of it. So the more that we can showcase to the adversary as well as to our allies and partners, the degree to which we're helping a nation develop resistance, right? That acts as a deterrent in and of itself. So again, information operations and messaging, I think, are critical when you talk about phase zero, and demonstrating to the adversary that hey, there's something here that you've got to put into your decision calculus. It's not purely iron on iron, formation against formation. If you can convince the adversary that there's a credible resistance capability within a nation, right? That completely changes the way they're going to come up with a plan to go into that nation. So territorial defense and home guard, those I don't want to say National Guard, but that's kind of how we look at it in America. When you look at those organizations and the role that they would potentially play in a conflict or in a resistance scenario, again, all different depending on the country, but they're going to play a key role, right? Those are the individuals that live in those areas. Now, granted, they may only train once a month or every couple months, or maybe for a finite period once a year, but that's okay. Host nation SOF can still engage with those resistance and home guard units, build those relationships so that we're ahead of the power curve in the event of a crisis or a conflict. I have not been dialed in yesterday, so I don't know how far you guys have talked about UW and resistance. But when you look at the different facets of resistance between the underground, the auxiliary, and the guerrillas, the territorial defense or home guard units, they're all going to play a role in those entities. So again, the more you can front load your efforts and build that connective tissue and relationships and develop some plans, the better off you're going to be in the event of a crisis or a conflict. All right, so I'm looking at the screen here. I see there's a question. It says, SOF and resistance organizations, is there any joint strategy or forms of relations in which those two, to some extent similar units, will be able to fully utilize their resistance potential as the one? I'm not really clear on the question. Is the question focused on SOF and resistance organizations, or All right, so I'll go there since this is not a back and forth dialogue. So um, I think the biggest role that SOF can play uh, when it comes to a resistance fight is, I think first and foremost, is helping to maintain connectivity with the legitimate government, right? Whether the legitimate government is still remaining in the host nation, or whether they've had to displace to a third location, based on the how the conflict is developed, right? But SOF, with their unique ability to make comms, right? That's going to be a key facet, whether it's U.S. SOF or whether it's the host nation SOF. But being able to ensure that the legitimate government from that host nation is controlling the resistance effort, and that the resistance effort is not out on its own. Um, with regards to the resistance as a whole, I think SOF will play a large part in the development and the employment of the guerrilla force. But that's not to say that the underground or the auxiliary could not also be supported by SOF. I think the challenge is, to have a successful resistance, it has to be survivable. And when you look at your underground and your auxiliary, they're going to be moving back and forth between large population centers. They're going to be likely operating where the adversary is that's occupying. So that's likely an area where uniform SOF are not going to want to be running around, right? They're going to want to be out in the hinterland with the guerrilla force, relying on the support from the auxiliary and the underground. But likely it's going to be a communications relationship with those two entities, as opposed to a partnered working together relationship, if that makes sense. So I will stop there, and hopefully that answered the question. Okay, so I'll continue on. So as we look at resistance and resilience, so resilience is, I think, a lot of times overlooked, right? We think about resistance, right? Hey, that's what we're going to do in the event of an adversary incursion. But not having a resilient population will make executing a resistance that much more challenging. So what do I mean by resilience, right? Resilience is not necessarily just focused on an adversary incursion, right? Resilience, that has to do with communications and news messaging that an adversary might be trying to push into a country, right? And so a resilient population, they know what news and media outlets to trust. They know where to go to find credible information. Also, when you talk about other subversive activities that an adversary could do, whether inflicting damage on communications infrastructure, the internet, banking systems, government, the ability for a government to function, a resilient population can endure those types of gray zone or asymmetric attacks better than a population that can be swayed or lured into buying the narrative of the adversary. So again, having a resilient population is crucial to being ready to engage in resistance activities in the event that you find yourself in that situation. Okay, I've got another question that just popped up here. Given the orientation of SOF over the past 20 plus years, how difficult do you think it will be to reorient SOF to assist in resistance development missions? This is an easy return to old norms, or I'm sorry, is this an easy return to old norms, or do we need to dedicate some time and effort to re-engage? So that's a great question, and that's something that we struggle with here every day, both with our U.S. SOF forces as well as our partner and allied SOF forces. Again, to the question, right? We've been doing CTCVEO, and we've been doing it pretty well for the last 20 years. So getting an organization of 70,000 plus U.S. SOF to transition to now essentially back to the future of looking at how we did things in the Cold War, right, is different. We have folks now who are retirement eligible within the U.S. SOF formation that all they've known is CTCVEO. So yes, it is a hurdle that we need to overcome. But I'll tell you that when I look at the formations that come into Europe, whether U.S. Army Special Forces, NSW, MARSOC, or AVSOC, I think they're starting to get it. And I think we've backed away from the GWAT enough now to where we're starting to see repeat offenders come to Europe, and we're starting to see that shift, and guys are understanding the value that SOF brings outside of doing raids and kicking in doors, which, right, that's one thing that we do in SOF, but it's not the only thing that we do in SOF. Another point I would bring up is our host nation partners, and particularly ones that may be at a higher risk of an incursion from an adversary than others. And when we go and engage with them and we ask, hey, where do you see your SOF going in 5, 10, 15 years from now? Oftentimes we get the question, hey, where can we deploy? Where can we go do CTCVEO with the U.S.? So again, it's not just U.S. It's our partners and allies as well who are looking at, hey, what we know is CTCVEO and doing direct action. How can we keep doing that activity? Where we're trying to say, hey, why don't we look at the adversary that we've got, right here in our own backyard, and maybe we should start changing our focus to look at that. But that's a great question, and I will tell you that it's something that we have to work through on a daily basis. Okay, next question. Instead of looking at romanticized World War II resistance examples, is there any effort to draw lessons from more contemporary but uncomfortable cases, such as insurgents and terrorists who have recently fought so effectively against modern conventional forces? It's a good question. I think yes. I think as we look at, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or now I think probably more recently Syria and some areas in Africa, I think there's absolutely value in looking at how those organizations have executed irregular warfare, against the U.S. and our allies and partners, as well as the host nations that they're trying to disrupt. Here in Europe, I would say that we're probably not doing as good of a job as we need to pull those lessons and incorporate those into what we're doing. But I'd say there's absolutely value in it, because odds are, if that's working against conventional, if it worked effectively against us, incorporating those methods would be, would arguably be successful against a strategic competitor. Next question. Given the current environment with China and Russia, how has that changed resilience in NATO countries? What direction do they need to go? So another great question. I think when we look at China and Russia, I'll tackle China first. While we don't see a lot of military activity from the PRC here in Europe, they're obviously diplomatically and economically heavily invested. And I think an area where Europe writ large can do a better job is educating themselves on the threat of China's diplomatic and economic means of power, and how they want to use those means to gain influence, and then I think ultimately gain control over key areas, whether it's ports, roads, you name it. They've got a means to an end on what they're doing. I think some nations have become more resilient, and they're seeing the activities of China in other parts of the world, and they're understanding, hey, that is a threat, and we've got to think long and hard about the degree to which we're going to engage with China. I think particularly when it comes to economic investment, although right, it's a very enticing offer that the Chinese bring. So again, countries that are not as economically well off as other countries, right? They're going to look at that, and it's going to be hard to turn away that offer. Now, when it comes to Russia, I think something interesting that we're seeing, right? We all have heard of Nord Stream. We've all heard of how Russia has used gas and oil to hold people at risk. So yes, that's something that I think Europe and some parts of Asia, right? They've got to look at, hey, how can I diversify my gas and oil intake so that I'm not as reliant on Russia. Now, granted, that for some, that's there's nothing they can do about it, right? That's the supplier they have, and they've got to deal with it. But I think to the extent that people can or that nations can find ways to diversify and not be as reliant on Russia, whether it's electricity in some cases in the Baltics or gas and oil in others. Next question. Since resilience focuses on population support for common effort, how do we avoid being pulled into internal divisions between the population and the host nation government? So that's a great question. I think we have to look at our role and how we are supporting that host nation government. Clearly, the U.S. will not put U.S. SOF into a nation if that nation is not in alignment with U.S. objectives or NATO objectives, for that matter. So the hope is, in a resistance type effort, we wouldn't get between the population and the government. Obviously, different case when you're talking about an insurgency. But I think for U.S. SOF and NATO SOF individuals who are going into a nation to help with resistance and resilience building, that's a great point. You always have to be mindful that you can't be doing anything that's counter to the host nation government and where they're trying to drive their force. Okay, next question. Preparing for resistance, what are the risks and considerations to be considered? Comparing Baltic and Eastern Europeans, Georgia, Ukraine, forms of resistance, is it just a matter of lack of resiliency? So, great question. I think, clearly there's a big difference between the three Bs because they're members of NATO, where Ukraine and Georgia are not. And while the three Bs also have ethnic Russian populations within their nations, I would say it might be to a greater extent in Georgia and Ukraine. So, a different challenge, when you look at a nation, let's say such as Ukraine or Georgia, where they do have a larger ethnic Russian population, right? That may be a willing partner for an adversary incursion or for gray zone activities. That's definitely a challenge. And I'd say it's a significant challenge when you talk about building resistance networks. If you can't, or if you are lacking fidelity or lacking trust in the host nation population, then it's going to be much more difficult to develop a resistance network, just because you don't know, or am I going to have, informants in the resistance network that I'm trying to work with. So obviously a big challenge there. I think when you talk about forms of resistance, I think it all depends, right? Each country is different, and what they want their resistance capability to be ready to do is different, right? Is it is the nation just looking for their SOF and their resistance forces to provide, indications and warning and be able to provide information and intelligence on what the adversary is doing in occupied areas? Or is that host nation looking at their resistance effort to be developed into something that is able to do kinetic activity, meaning, offensively go after the adversary, while waiting for the larger joint force to come in and expel the adversary? So yes, I would say there's a difference, and it's going to depend on what each country is looking for out of their resistance capability. Okay, next question. How much civ mil influence has Russia had on Europe with respect to countering resistance resilience efforts? That's a great question. I'm not aware of any Russian activity to influence the resistance and resilience efforts that SOF and host nations have been developing. But I may just be missing it. What I will say is, we all know that the activities that the Russians are undertaking, through surrogates and others, information means, right? Those are destabilizing, and they're gonna, those are things that will cause a host nation population to question their government. Are we doing the right thing, or should we be looking at what the Russians are trying to offer? But I don't know of any circumstances where Russia has done anything to actively undermine or counter any resistance and resilience development efforts that have been undertaken. Okay, next question. If resistance, the porcupine, is the answer, then why are we trying to do it with amateurs, aka part-time civilians, and why not advocate for creating professional resistance organizations? If you decide to play football, you want to play it with professionals for maximum results. Great question. I think what it comes down to is to build a professional resistance force. I would say that's your general purpose force military. I don't mean to be flippant, but if we're talking about developing a professional resistance force, I see that as being the military that's there to hopefully counter an incursion. I think resistance, right? It is designed to be a whole of government, whole of nation activity. So again, when you look at how would we professionalize that and make it a standing entity, I think that probably the closest you could get would be using those territorial defense or home guard type units, which many nations are. They're actively working and training with their home guard units to have that capability. But it might be a challenge to create a professional resistance organization. I think that would look like another arm of the military that would be a standing component and not something that you would need to energize in the time of crisis. Okay, I was just told I'm out of time, so I will stop there. General Howard or moderators, do you have anything else for me?
No, Peter, that was a great presentation, and thank you for taking all the questions. Generally, I would have asked the questions, but I could just sit here and sip my coffee. So thanks. We've had two great perspectives from Europe on this topic, and yours is, you hit it out of the park for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it, and thank you to JSOU for the invite. This was interesting. A lot of good, thought-provoking questions that I'm interested to take back to the team and get their thoughts on. So I hope the rest of the course goes well. And again, thank you for the invite. It was great to spend the morning with you.
No, thanks again.